I'm John, and I will be talking with Karl today. So as a little bit of an introduction, so this is Karl Nägler from Wellington Partners, and so he has more than 18 years of experience in the life science industry, and he started with a PhD in molecular neurobiology in Germany, and he's worked at a number of investment firms such as Atlas Venture, Ventec, and GIMV. And so I'll be asking Karl some questions over the next 20 minutes or so, and then we can open up the discussion to questions from the audience. So Karl, so nice to see you. And so I look at your experience, long experience as an investor, and it's a very impressive kind of a career you have. And so can you tell me a bit about when you encountered immuno-oncology for the first time as an investor, and what your initial impression was?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because when I joined the industry in 2001 as an analyst at Atlas, I would say among most VC investors and also within our firm, immuno-oncology was a bit of a dirty word. There had just been too many failed trials over the years, autologous cells, immune stimulators, vaccines. And we also had difficult experiences in our portfolio. We had one company called IDM, Immunodesign Molecules company. I think it was started in '93 and had a pipeline of autologous cell products, immune modulators, stimulators, and was a bit of a difficult equity story. Although some of the products, if I pulled out one description to look it up against today, sound quite interesting. So I can just read it out: a humanized bispecific antibody-based cell drug comprised of monocyte-derived activated killer cells associated with a bispecific antibody which acts by targeting HER2 and CD64. Sounds quite modern today. At that time, it sounded quite esoteric, like science fiction, and this will never work, it's far too complicated, etc. I think the issue was that many of those ideas were based on concepts from the 80s, and there was just not enough knowledge about the immunology of cancers at that time to make such drugs work. And also, probably we didn't know how to study those drugs because one has to do it a bit more differently and look more carefully at the effects. So lesson at that time, IO is just complicated and doesn't work. We also had Micromet in our portfolio. So that's an example of a very successful IO pioneer, but that was not so apparent at that time. So again, the equity story was difficult. Lots of capital was raised, and it was a bit of an orphan shareholding at Atlas, and we sold it as part of a secondary to Omega at the time. However, blinatumomab was already in the pipeline, so that's the now approved CD19, CD3 T-cell engager. But it looked at that time to be a complicated story. There was neurotoxicity, the half-life was an issue. We didn't know how to deliver it. I mean, today still it's delivered as with a mini pump, but it looked again like something that is not just complex but also difficult to finance. I think one should also maybe remember T-General, that CD28 superagonist that had that disastrous dose escalation in 2006 was targeted for autoimmune and cancer, and then many people also thought that trying to tune the immune system with antibodies is dangerous. So at that time, I would say until the mid 2000s, IO was by many investors considered as capital-intensive, complicated, difficult to out-license early to pharma, and just doesn't work and is probably dangerous. So my first oncology investment was UC Pharma and Martin's Reed. And that was 2003, I think, and that was about targeted therapies. So exactly, I would say the opposite. Was focused around an antibody against HER3. It was all about signaling, selectivity, specificity. We had a few discussions about whether the antibody should have ADCC, and then we had the example of Herceptin, which has some ADCC, but pertuzumab, which works just as well without ADCC. So we just thought about signaling at that time. So it was a totally different mindset. And then I left Atlas in 2009 and joined Ventec. And the first deal, it was really, I just came to the office after a couple of days. Munya Chaui, was the other partner at the time, took me aside and talked about BioVax, that the deal that she wanted to do. So BioVax, a Boston-based oncolytic virus play. Oncolytic virus, intratumoral injection, had just gone through a phase 2 in melanoma. And I was a bit, let's say, shocked because, I was thinking, what are they doing here? I just joined the firm and they come with that type of story. And, but they convinced me. Yeah? And what they told me is that, it's not just an intratumoral injection. There's some effect on distal sites, distal lesions. There's an abscopal effect. So antigens are being released and, then T cells would also go after other lesions. And in fact, the virus was designed for that. It was releasing GM-CSF in order to attract dendritic cells to then stimulate the T cells. And we ended up doing the investment, or my colleagues ended up doing the investment. And 2 years later, the company was acquired for $1 billion total deal value by Amgen, after they saw hints for that abscopal effect in the ongoing phase 3. And that was then learning for me, and that was 2011. So that's the bottom line to your question. Since then, I'm a believer in IO. Before that, I was not at all.
Interesting. So you had your own personal turnaround point, basically. And what do you think the turnaround point was for the industry? So other investors, for example, what changed their minds?
So I think, it became obviously very apparent when the first data came out on the CTLA-4. So I think that was in the early 2010, 11. I think got approved in 2011, and then of course the PD-1 and PD-L1s. I also remember a board meeting at an autoimmune company. I was involved with Covagen, where at some point the CEO came and told the board that we have to switch gears to work on checkpoint inhibition. And that was around the time, 2011, when I think it became apparent to everybody in the industry that something important is going on. And I think then, after the approvals in 2014, the ASCO, I think then we were on that big frenzy that is still ongoing. So I think it was, after 2011, I think when it was becoming a broadly accepted concept in the industry.
And so nowadays it's getting quite hyped. So it's kind of big deals, lots of interest from investors now. And in your opinion, has the field met the expectations of a lot of these investors and of the hype?
I would say to 50%. So that's quite precise. I explain why. At that time, 2014, when Opdivo and Keytruda got approved, I think analysts expected peak sales to be reached in 2020. So this year of 20 billion for each product. I think today we are at 7 for Opdivo and 14 for Keytruda. So that's pretty much 50%. So is that good or bad? I bought at that time BMS and Merck shares. BMS lost a bit, Merck gained a lot. So overall, I think it's positive. To be more serious, in essence, I think we have opened a very important new door. And we will just maybe in one of the first rooms and then find some interesting tools that we start to combine, and we find new tools. But I think we will see that this is the right house, the right castle that will eventually help us to find many of the tools that we need to eventually cure cancer. Of course, many of the other concepts are still relevant, but I think we found probably now the most important castle. So it will take a while, and it took longer than we thought. There was at the beginning the expectation that it would be quite straightforward to combinations to bring up the response rates from the 20% to maybe 60, 70, 80%. works in few situations, but it's not yet the magic bullet for all cancer entities. We have also seen many disappointments of other checkpoint targets that have not delivered. But then on the other hand, we have seen exceptional responses we see in the cell therapy. So we have very good examples that basically teach us that's the way to go. Yeah? So as I said, there's good and bad things, but overall, I think we are on track, and we not fully, but to a large extent, that's the expectations.
Okay, and so in terms of going forward, which areas are you most excited about in immuno-oncology, and maybe also tell me which ones you're the least excited about?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit about our portfolio, because it's obviously expressing a representation of what we like. So at Wellington right now, we have quite a number of companies in the innate field. We were invested in Labiotech, which we sold to Merck, but then Labiotech.eu is Stipe Therapeutics, which is also working on the STING pathway. So that's basically downstream DNA sensing. So when cells are stressed through virus, cancer, release DNA, it's being sensed and stimulates in the immune system, the innate immune system. This is one area that we have explored. Then charisma therapeutics, macrophage CARs. So macrophages, which might bring a couple of advantages vis-a-vis CD8 T cells in terms of manufacturing, but also how they can maybe better navigate through the tumor microenvironment. I myself on the board of ImCheck. So they are working on activators of gamma delta T cells. It's in fact broader. It's a target class, proterophilins, but they're involved in, let's say, activating cells of the innate immune system and cells that are somewhere in between the innate and adaptive immune system. And why do we like that? Because that's one way of making cold tumors hot, which will then help the other IO approaches. But it might also employ other cytotoxic cells that may work in situations where CD8s can just not work anymore because either they're exhausted or the antigens are not there anymore. So that in simple broad terms, if 20% response rate represents what CD8s can do, there might be other arms of the immune system that you need to employ to fill the gap, rather than trying to push the same gas pedal, which is already at the bottom. So that's why we like the innate. But another area that we're interested in is novel checkpoint targets. I think it's ASCO. There were some interesting data, I think by Roche, around their TIGIT. So that's another well-known checkpoint target, and shows that there's still some room to play. So our portfolio company Iomics here in Munich is working on that. They have a discovery engine around novel checkpoint targets pipeline there. So that's another theme that we are playing. However, besides of that, if you ask me what am I mostly interested in, if I also look at new investment opportunities, there are a couple of things which are not so much related to what exactly the biology is the company is working on. Because if you're honest, I mean, if you remember the hallmarks of cancer, I think it's 10 or so by now, or and each year, a couple of years, there's got to be a few more. There are many different processes that one can or should interfere with in order to attack cancer. So it's tough to say that.
Can you just tell me? Can you just tell me a little bit about what you're not really excited about then?
Yes, I think let's say an example of something that is difficult. It's maybe less a piece of biology, but it's, let's say, a project where we don't know which patients could benefit from it, where we cannot select the patients. I mean, that's in fact often a theme in IO. Then things where we already know that they don't have single agent activity, not because I don't think that this might not be relevant, but it's very difficult to study. What that basically means from an investor viewpoint is that you have to go always quite far before you can prove in clinical research, whether you have something very exciting or not. So it's turning it around, things that can have single agent activity, where you have defined patient populations. That's already a good starting point to have better chances of showing early on differentiation and have a more interesting equity story in the end.
And so I want to talk a little bit about so you as an investor, and what do you look for when you are choosing companies that you think would be worth an investment?
Yes, I think one very important element is the level of differentiation. I mean, is it really novel? And that's getting more and more complicated in this field because the largest part of biotech is oncology, and the largest part of oncology is IO. So how to differentiate? Then what I also look at always is a pedigree, the scientific foundation. Does it come out of a highly renowned academic group? And that's a quite general concept, of course. But here it is particularly important because often, since it's such a novel field, what we are doing is to work on novel targets, pathways. We are doing target validation and discovery work at the same time. And that is, of course, if you do that on more than one project, very capital intensive. So ideally, there's already a good scientific base, a very also deep scientific base on the project that you can build on. Because if you have to start with basic science in this field, I mean, it will take a long time and will be very expensive. So that's why the pedigree, the strength of the scientific base is very important. I think there's by now a lot of modalities, different types of therapeutic entities that one can use. If you say for this target we need a small molecule, we can make a small molecule. It's feasible. Even if you outsource a lot of the work, if it's an antibody, it's an antibody. If it's a bispecific or even a cell therapy, it's feasible to get this done. However, one should avoid unnecessary risk of doing that because that's not the core of what it's about. So the level of sophistication, in that respect of the team, the technical capability. But then obviously there also needs to be talent that's very strong on the biology side and a bit more, let's say, innovative and out of the box. So the team composition, because you need all of this, strong scientific foundation, very strong experience, technical capability on development issues, etc. And then, the talents, the IO know-how, and this then coupled, the strategy, business thinking. So that's super important in this field to be successful. And as I said, how differentiated is it really?
Yes, that's interesting. And so before I open up to some questions from the audience, I just want to know about your perspective on the COVID-19 pandemic, which has reshuffled a lot of priorities for companies such as BioNTech, for example, who are now opening up a new program into a vaccine. So can you tell me how you see this pandemic affecting investments into immuno-oncology going forward?
Yeah, so we could see impacts on nearly each and every of our portfolio company, sometimes positive impact, often there's delays. And then, it depends a bit on, what is the burn rate of the company? Is it just, the short hibernation period and then you restart and you lost a bit of time? Or is it a more severe issue where you cannot reach anymore? And that's, I think, the most important parameter, where you cannot reach anymore within, a financing round that was designed to get to a certain milestone, So if the gap is getting too large, then that means that needs to be another cash injection. We could, in most of our companies, avoid that type of scenario. Although, in the IO, if I talk about InCheck, we had just started our phase 1 in March. And amazingly, we could recruit patients. But there was then, a period when nothing was possible. We had centers in France, in Spain, and Germany. So of course it was very difficult. But as of today, if I look at the original plans where we stand today, it's not a big difference anymore. Things are getting back to normal. Of course, at the beginning we were very scared. We, were thinking about, going even into other directions. And but I think by now we are back on track and focused on our original plan and haven't lost that much. So I know that in France and also in Germany, centers are recruiting again. So it's getting back to normal.
Actually, just a quick follow-up question on that. So is there any advice that you would give to any immuno-oncology entrepreneurs right now venturing into this field, given this situation?
I think the general advice in IO, and it's again a bit general, but very relevant here too. Think about the end from the beginning. It's not just about the novelty of the pathway or what you can see in ex vivo or in vitro setting. How can we very early on show that this is relevant in a particular patient setting, and how is that differentiated from other approaches that could target the same patient setting? I think that is something that I'm often missing, and that companies then, where they need time to develop it, and some of the earlier business plans that I see, because the issues of early development in that field, it's very competitive. It's sometimes difficult to find patients. They will not get easier, and it's becoming also very capital intensive. In the past, oncology was thought as easy because, that's long time ago, because you could get to objective responses in phase 1. This is not the case in IO. You might have to go to expansion cohorts, and you will still, talk about maybe a lot of stable disease, a few responses. It just takes a long time, and therefore you need to be able to explain early on why this is very important for a particular patient setting. So biomarkers, the translational package should all go into that direction.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Karl. And so I'm going to open this up to now some questions from the audience as well. So I think Joachim was going to have a look at some of these.
Yes, I'm coming back. And first, thank you both for the talk, and thanks to our participant for the question. So we have one already. So Karl, we are seeing right now an influx of generalist capital into the public market, driven by the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of money being invested by public institutions. Do you see this influx of money also carrying over to immuno-oncology?
I think there's a general higher interest in the field, because it's probably recognized that the asset class of pharma there's a different cycle, as you can see here very clearly in this crisis. It's a sector that generally is less coupled to market fluctuations. Is more stable, and here it's really everybody realizes now that it's not just about treating certain diseases, but it's generally the sector that can help us to very deep crisis. But I think it's more a trend that will probably stay for a while, and therefore also IO will indirectly benefit from it. That's nobody don't have a crystal ball, but my feeling is that there's a high appreciation for the sector by society and therefore also by journalists. Well, there's a good example here in Germany. We have, that blog by Christian Drosten, who at the beginning daily and now every couple of days talked about, the science around COVID-19. And I was shocked to see that many of my friends who were never interested in what I'm doing listen to it. And, they asked me questions about the R and K factor that I cannot answer, and what better than me by now.
Yeah, we see it also now. Everybody heard about biotech companies like Moderna in the big newspaper. And, it's becoming more relevant. And by the way, this question was from Gretchen Schweitzer. Sorry for the mispronunciation. We have another question from Sergei Glinka, co-founder and CEO of Crystals First, a German company, asking about difficult to hit targets. So these targets that are difficult to hit in immuno-oncology. Can you talk a bit more about it? And in this context, Sergei was in particular asking about Amgen KRAS inhibitor. I don't know if you have some knowledge about this kind of targets.
Yes, a little bit, of course, and there was a bit of a breakthrough. I would say, we are usually, we haven't yet invested into situations or considered situations where it's about there's a certain target class that is sort of validated, and now we're trying to find better inhibitors or activators of the target. It's usually more there's a piece of biology, and we're trying to find ways to work on it. I think that will be probably an interesting question in that respect. It will be probably the next phase, where, yes, we have established that certain checkpoints, etc., work. Why not coming up with a more potent molecule that has better pharmacology, etc.? I think it might have happened a little bit. People have tried on PD-1 with other antibody formats, etc. But we are not at that point yet broadly. There's a few examples in the DDR space. We have a little bit of that, but I think the field is not at that point.
And I'm just seeing a question also interesting in this kind of aspect from Eduardo Negroni. What do you think about CAR-T in solid tumors? Because it's been a bit the next big challenge. I think we see it quite a lot recently in the news. What's your opinion on it?
Yes, I think there are some hints that it might, after all, be possible. I mean, Adaptimmune, their stock doubled in early studies, admittedly, but I think it points into the right direction. They might have, with their technology, found a way now. The receptors. I'm a bit skeptical for other reasons. I think technically it will eventually work out, but if we see what's happening in IO, with the checkpoint inhibitors now, they're moving more earlier in the disease, from metastatic to locally advanced disease. They will become a backbone also, at earlier stages. And, then I wonder for just economic reasons, cost benefit, you need simple formats, if that's a trend. And therefore, I'm still believing in the conventional antibodies, bispecifics. These are also already, expensive molecules, but cell therapy, even if it's not autologous anymore, to get to a price point where you can use it more earlier, which is eventually what you have to do in immune systems that are not already knocked down by cycles of chemotherapy and other treatments. I'm not sure whether I see it. It's maybe the first step to then come up with other formats that can do the same. But I think, maybe 2 years ago, I would have been like, I don't know whether it's going to work. I think it's going to work. Some sort of tumors eventually.
Yeah. And about other technologies, we are seeing also some examples of companies trying to use AI or genomics linked to immuno-oncology therapies. What do you think of this kind of combinations?
So we have seen companies, obviously, side of diagnosis, because the issue that we still have today is that it's hard to explain who would respond to anticipate checkpoint therapy or not. So we've seen a couple of these companies, and it's usually you need many different types of information. Not just genomics, it's also immunohistochemistry, so in order to drive decisions. There's then also a bit of the idea that we need, we also need to provide a therapy plan, and we need to involve the outpatient and the hospital, and we need to pull all those data together. And so we have seen these types of business plans, which the healthcare services type of side. I think it's very important. I haven't seen it so much on the IO discovery side yet. I mean, of course, we have seen companies that use AI to accelerate discovery, small molecule screening, etc., but very much focused on IO. I haven't seen that yet. Would be interesting if there's.
So we have a question, I think, bringing us a bit outside of IO, but that's interesting as an investor perspective. So question from Stefan van den Abelen from CD80 Consulting is asking you mentioned that you're always looking at the science and the people behind the science when you're investing in a company. And he's asking how you do it in details. Is it through interviews? Do you even have stress tests or other kind of methods to really find the good entrepreneurs, good scientists?
So I've done it, in particular situations, even employing consultants, do a management assessment, etc., where there were questions or issues that were already apparent. Normally, we don't do that. We work a lot through references. I mean, that's maybe also important to understand. I mean, it's usually not people we have never heard about that send us a business plan that we then get overly excited. It's often, it's a very small circle that we are operating in. It's often people that we have heard of before, or that we know that we then also end up backing. And if it's young entrepreneurs don't have a relationship, then we try to convince them that through the board or through the team, there should be additional elements in the team with people that bring that experience and also call it footprint in the scene. So therefore, we are not, and maybe not stringent and structured enough the way we assess management, because it's not only about somebody, a good manager or not. It's also about the team composition and, also, how does it fit to the size of the company, the processes, how can we avoid issues in the future? I think it's certainly something on top of developing an organization where we should be probably more professional than we are. It's still a lot relationship based.
Your focus is more on the science also, maybe like due diligence on the science and.
Yeah, so it's just one element, But there are different styles. I mean, just a very quick anecdote. I had the pleasure still to work with Jean Leleage, who's sort of the godfather of venture capital, not just in Europe, I think worldwide. I mean, he's behind Sofinnova and Alta, and I once had a due diligence. In fact, it was on U3, where I was very proud as young analyst to look at what I put together, and I showed it to him, and I said, "Oh, Karl, this is very interesting. I know those guys. They know what they're doing." And that's how he viewed it all. And he was he was not a biologist or anything, but he was one of the best investors, just assessing people, investing into people where he believed that, a good guy, his opinion was a good guy will not associate himself with a bad product. And he went very far with that.
And that's what the partners at Sofinova are always saying. They invest in people first, and I guess it's also coming from their foundation.
It's the same pedigree, except that I know they're doing also heavy technical due diligence.
Yeah, sure. Of course. So we are close. We will take one last question. We have a question from the same person, also interesting. So thank you, Stefan, for all the questions. Does COVID-19 brings new limited partners in biotech? Do you see this kind of interest?
Sorry, can you please repeat?
Is the COVID-19 crisis bringing new limited partners in biotech, to new funds for you to invest?
This we haven't seen yet. I mean, there's of course government initiatives. Like the COVID matching fund here in Germany from the KfW. This you could call, additional money, not going really so much to us, but the companies through us. Limited partners, and I think if it happens, it can only happen now. Then we had the dip in the stock market. I mean, they had to reallocate assets. We got many calls asking, how much cash will you need in the next quarter, because we need to manage cash now. There was a bit of a different reaction initially, and I think we are out of that now, and now we need to see how they position themselves. I think eventually there will, as I described earlier, be the same consideration. If you want to spread risk, maybe we should get into that asset class, which in this particular situation was even less volatile than it anyway is. So that could happen, but it's probably too early.
Yeah, okay. So a question we can ask you at the next refresh. So we are out of time. Thank you both. Thank you a lot, Karl, for your talk today. I will disconnect you now. We will start very soon the second talk. So yeah, thanks a lot for being with us today.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.